Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Thank you very much. It's an unbelievable pleasure to be here at WashU. In my career, I've spoken here several times. It was a special thrill to be told that I'd be on the same stage with my good friend Ursula. A few of you may know me or know of me. I'm a cell biologist. Like Ursula, I work on biological membrane structure and function. My main research tool is the electron microscope, and that's something that Ursula and I share. I have another career, and I see a lot of young people in the audience, and some of you probably already know me and you don't like me. And the reason for that is if when you were in high school, you used any of these books for biology, I wrote them. That's called Biology by Miller and Levine. So therefore, if you lugged one of those books around when you were in 9th or 10th grade, yeah, it's my fault. Sorry about that. It's sort of an interesting thing. I've been blessed with two daughters, and at one point, my oldest daughter, Lauren, was lucky enough to graduate from Dighton-Rehoboth Regional High School in Massachusetts, where we live, before my first book came out. But Tracy, my youngest, was not so lucky, and she had to suffer the indignity of using her old man's book for biology in high school. And for years, I lived in a little town called Rehoboth, and for years, a lot of people in the town knew who I was, but not because of what I did for a living. It's because for 8 or 9 years, I was kind of like the commissioner of the girls' softball program. So everybody knew Miller as the softball guy, but they didn't know what I did for a living. Then the high school got one of those books, the ones with the elephant on the cover. And my cover was blown, and you might think it's a cool thing to have a school in your town use your textbook. I guess it kind of is. But about a month into that school year, I'm driving up to the high school to pick Tracy up after field hockey practice. And as I pull in front of the high school, there's a woman I know through softball. She's another coach. Her name is Bonnie Kelly. And she sees me. She gets very excited. She flags me down. She goes, Ken, you wrote the book they're using in the high school now. And I puffed my chest out and I smiled and I said, yes, Bonnie, I did. And then she looked me straight in the eyes and she said, funny thing is you don't seem that smart. So it's never quite sure what to make of that, but you can decide for yourself, I guess. As you heard in that very kind introduction, I've also written a couple books on evolution and religion. And also, as you heard, I started my academic career at Harvard and started out there as a junior faculty member. I wanted to bring documentation of that. Ursula might recognize the picture here. And in fact, Ursula was the chair of the search committee that actually hired me for that first position. So in the 70s, I was an assistant professor, and I was literally Ursula Goodenough's neighbor across the hallway in the biological labs. Well, we're not here to talk about old times, so that we may get around to that later tonight. We're here to talk about something else. This is one of my favorite church signs that's been widely distributed on the internet. If we evolved from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? If anybody has that question, I can answer it later on. It's a rather easy one to answer. But what we're dealing with, in many respects, is a stereotype. And it's a stereotype that rational science is at war with irrational faith. And that's a stereotype that's widely held not just in the general society, but in academia as well. It's an issue that I've taken a position on repeatedly. There are many examples of that. One of the ones that really is the best known was that about 5 or 6 years ago, a school board in a small town called Dover, Pennsylvania, voted to instruct their biology teachers to prepare a curriculum on something called intelligent design. 11 parents sued the school board, arguing this was inherently religious and a violation of their First Amendment rights. As Americans, I had the honor, although I'm not sure that's the right word, of being the lead witness testifying for those parents in that trial. It's led to all sorts of extraordinary things. This is actually the NBC TV courtroom sketch of my cross-examination on the first day of the trial. It was a remarkable thing. I didn't even know this sketch was on TV until about 11 o'clock at night, and my mother called me up and said, Kenny, you're on TV. And there it was. So I then found out what my mother does at 11 o'clock at night, which is she watches CNN, and then she said, I saw that sketch, Ken. Have you really lost that much hair? And the answer was, yeah, Mom. The trial lasted, believe it or not, for 7 weeks. It was heard in front of a conservative Republican judge appointed to the bench by President George W. Bush, and the outcome was very clear by the end of the trial. The case for so-called intelligent design just literally fell apart. This ended up being front-page news in newspapers all over the country. We had all the nightly news reports that night. Some of you may know that this was documented in a Nova TV program called Judgment Day, which I highly recommend for anyone who's interested in the sort of evolution-creation controversy. I ended up as one of the talking heads in that documentary, which is very interesting. But I have to say, in the aftermath of the trial, I wound up doing even more interesting things on TV in terms of interviews, and I'm not sure if any of you saw these, but there I am, opposite Stephen Colbert on the Colbert Report. I've now made 2 appearances on the Colbert Report. There's nothing you can do in academia that will prepare you for sitting opposite Stephen Colbert, and I can tell you about that a little bit later on. But I think one of the assumptions that I want to address very briefly, because we really do want to have a dialogue tonight, is very simple. And that is, doesn't evolution say that God doesn't exist? And the person you see here is arguably the most famous evolutionary biologist in the world, Richard Dawkins of Oxford University. For my money, the greatest writer on evolutionary theory alive today. I recommend Dawkins' books to everyone. And a couple of years ago, BBC Magazine, at the 200th anniversary of the birth of Charles Darwin, had an interview with Dawkins. And as a sidebar in that interview, they asked whether or not the theory of evolution is compatible with the idea of divine creation. And for commentary on this, they actually went across the Atlantic and they asked a couple of Americans. One of them was Daniel Dennett. Daniel Dennett, the philosopher of science at Tufts University, said, no, it is not. I wrote the opposing commentary saying, yes, it is. And I'd be glad to elaborate on that tonight in our discussion. But to me, this is the way I'd like to put it, to me, what we get from Darwin is the following. And that is that there's an evolutionary design to life that is inherent in the natural world. And as a biologist, you see this design to life, which comes out of the process of evolution everywhere. And what that means is that the emergence of a living world like the one that we have, the one in which we live, is not a random accident, but it's an outcome that was driven by the processes that are built into the fabric of nature itself. In other words, we didn't emerge from the natural world as human beings, we emerged with the natural world. And the great insight that comes out of Darwin with respect to our own existence is that we are part of nature and nature produced us. And that leads to a lot of ways in which we can understand this. And a people of faith, and I speak to religious audiences all the time, I think the fruitfulness of evolution, the way in which we live in a planet that is literally bursting with evolutionary possibilities, can be understood, as I typed on the slide, as a reflection of divine creativity and promise. You couldn't even imagine a world that was more laden with possibilities for life. If you're a non-religious person, evolution is still out there. It's simply a property of nature itself. But either way, the study of nature is the same, whether one is a theist or a non-theist. And this, ultimately, I would argue, is why evolution is compatible with faith. Now, I'm not the only person to take that position. This is Theodosius Dobzhansky, probably the greatest evolutionary geneticist of the 20th century, one of the great contributors to the modern synthesis. He wrote a famous article that almost all biologists know, and the message of the article is in the title, and that is, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And boy, is that true. But if you read the whole article, you'll find something out about Dobzhansky that might surprise you. Here's a section of the article. He says, the diversity of life is reasonable and understandable if the Creator created the living world not by caprice, but by evolution propelled by natural selection. And then he said something that many scientists would find surprising. It is wrong to hold creation and evolution as mutually exclusive alternatives. I, Dobzhansky, am a creationist and an evolutionist. Dobzhansky was a Christian. The reason he says that is because God, evolution is God or nature's method of creation. Creation is not an event that happened in 4004 BC. It is a process that started some 10 billion years ago and still is underway today. Anybody agree with Dobzhansky on this? As it turns out, Charles Darwin did. This is a very famous letter that he wrote to a skeptic named John Fordyce. And he confessed in this that his own state of mind was closer to agnostic than anything else. But at the beginning of the letter, look what Darwin wrote. It seems to me absurd to doubt that a man may be an ardent theist and an evolutionist. And I think Darwin got it exactly right. So that's what a couple of scientists, great scientists, think. What do religious people think? Well, no less a person than Pope Benedict has spoken out on this issue. These are some excerpts from an interview that he gave to a group of Italian journalists. And in there is the following statement. The contrast, he means the conflict between creation and evolution, is an absurdity, because there are many scientific tests in favor of evolution, which appears as a reality that we must see, and which enriches our understanding of life and being. That's kind of bureaucratic language. So if you find that a little too complex to parse, go to the source that I always use when I need simplification of a complex issue. You know what that is, it's the New York Post. Evolution and God do mix hope. So there you got it, and you got it in a very straightforward way. And again, when I speak to Christian audiences, very often I like to point out this view of an evolving universe, even though that word isn't used, is very much in the Christian tradition. St. Augustine, one of the earliest and most prolific of all Christian writers, beginning of the 5th century, wrote, "The universe was brought into being in a less than fully formed state, but was gifted to transform itself from unformed matter into a truly marvelous array of structures and life forms." Now, when I speak to scientific audiences, they often are a little suspicious of Augustine. And I was once asked by a geneticist, what kind of science would you get if you followed the precepts of a weird 5th century mystic like Augustine? And I smiled when I heard that question. And I said, I'm going to answer you with a personal answer. What you see up here is a young man who in his youth, devoted his life to the priesthood. He was very religious. He later was named the abbot of the Augustinian monastery of St. Thomas in Brunn, in what is today the Czech Republic. At one point in his life, this very religious person got interested in today what you and I would call a scientific question. What did he do? Did he read scripture? Of course he did. He read it every day. Did he pray? Of course he did, several times a day. But when he was confronted by a scientific question, you know what he did? He went into the garden and he did experiments. That Augustinian priest was Father Gregor Mendel, the founder of the modern science of genetics. So what kind of science do you get if you follow Augustinian precepts? You get darn good science, you get genetics. And I think that's as powerful a lesson about the compatibility of science and religion as you can get. But here's another one. This is a statement from Einstein that has always intrigued me. Einstein was not a theist. He's best described as an agnostic, but he had tremendous respect for religious thought. And look at what he writes here. Those individuals to whom we owe the great creative achievements of science were all of them imbued with the truly religious conviction that this universe of ours is something perfect and susceptible to the rational striving for knowledge. And as a Christian, I regard that as a key to understanding the universe. And I'm often asked by people, and this is the slide that I will close with, what kind of God could exist in a scientific world in which nature acts according to orderly, predictable rules that those of us in science can understand, study, and describe? Well, I think the answer to that is a God who fashioned a world that is rational and intelligible. So putting it another way, for people of faith, God should never be regarded as the antithesis of scientific reason. Rather, God should be regarded as the reason why rational science works in the first place. Thanks very much.
This is the one that works here. Good evening. So I decided to use my 5 minutes to just get us having some of the language that we use identified at least, and you may not agree with the way that I'm using these words, but that means that you can fill out your forms and say what I did wrong. I want to start first with theist. So I would say that a theist believes in the existence of something else besides nature, all right? And we can use the word God here, but lots of theists don't use the word God. They have other ideas about what there is other than nature. And the theist then is challenged and comes to some understanding within him or herself of what this besides nature part of her religious experience, what the influence of this something else has on nature. Is it creative? Is it, are miracles formed, and so on. So this relationship then gets to be described either in one's own mind or in one's house of faith. So the antithesis is the atheist who rejects the idea of something else besides nature, and I don't need to define that probably any further than that. So are those the only two options? Well, I came up with a third called a religious non-theist because to me, I do not believe that there's something else outside of nature, nor do I reject the idea that there's something else besides nature. For me, the God question, the God concepts just are not part of my religious life, and that is something that I'm very happy to expand upon if you're curious. So I see myself as religious, but as non-theistic, but not denying or rejecting, it's just not part of my religious life. So then you might well ask, well, what is my religious life? And I call myself a religious naturalist, and would say that that means that I explore the religious potential of our scientific understandings of nature without using the God language as I go. This, of course, then raises another question. What do you mean by being religious? If you don't believe in God, how can you say you're religious? Well, my understanding from what I've read and talked to people is that a religious person adopts some sort of core narrative, a myth, a story, and by saying myth and story, I don't in any way imply that they are not true. So the core narrative of the Christian faith, and of course, is what's written in the Bible and by subsequent Christian theologians and thinkers. And this core narrative then becomes something that one uses to develop three integrated but still separable responses. One is an interpretation of the story, so the interpretive axis. One, a spiritual response, which I think of as sort of internal feelings of awe and wonder and gratitude and so on. And then moral responses. And these are then done in the context of that narrative. So in traditional religions, the core narrative written by humans, at least proximately, these responses are embedded in the narrative. The narrative includes interpretations, includes moral ideas. If one is a religious naturalist and adopts as one's core story this our understandings of nature and its evolution, then those responses aren't built into the story. Nature just is, doesn't provide books in human language. So therefore, as a religious naturalist, one is forced, or one has to respond religiously to this story, either by personal search or in community with others who are so engaged. So a naturalist takes nature seriously. So any of you who are science majors or whatever, you take what the natural world is seriously. A religious naturalist also takes nature seriously. But a religious naturalist, somehow this got off my slide in my editing, but the third piece on the screen should read, the religious naturalist also takes nature to heart. And this concept of taking something to heart is beautifully written here by my friend Loyal Rue, where he's talking about taking something to heart as a theist. And he writes, "If I were to say that I have taken the Quran to heart, you might infer that the teachings of the Quran now shape how I think, feel, and act. I now take Allah's will as my own, and I have a newly clarified sense of who I am, where I came from, and where I am going. Taking the Quran to heart alters the fabric of my self-understanding, it shifts my teleological center of gravity, and I operate differently in my efforts to live in harmony with that reality." So that is taking something to heart in a theistic and in a standard religious context. So, as a religious naturalist, what my spiritual and moral guides have to do with this understanding of nature. So, for example, in just the recent decades, we've come to be able to put up a chart like this that shows the archaea, bacteria, and eukaryotes, life forms on our planet, to all share a common ancestry and to have some 3.5 billion years ago, and to have radiated off into these 3 different pathways. And when we look just at the eukaryotes, we see all of these wonderfully different forms, the plants and so on. And, here we are, here, in this context, let alone the context of the bacteria. And for me, this deeply nurtures my sense of humility, and it gives me this sense that evolution, which is often described so incorrectly as being the survival of the fittest, that's not what it is at all. The whole process of evolution has been and continues to be one of fitting in, one of being part of this whole glorious adventure. And finally, I find that these understandings help me not only in my moral life with my family and my friends and my community, but has nurtured something that I call eco-morality, a morality that extends to all of life and to the planet. Now, if you take something to heart, that means your heart can be broken. And this is true whether one is taking a traditional faith to heart or operating as a religious naturalist. So that when one has taken nature to heart, this whole mess is heartbreaking. And this is heartbreaking. And so is this. Not only is your heart broken, but at that point you come to experience moral outrage when what you revere is insignificant. So, can a religious naturalist be a theist? I'll just say, sure. And you want to ask me about that? Please do. Can a religious naturalist be a Christian? Sure. I know a lot of them. Does evolution imply atheism? Of course not. Ken has already made that clear. And the other question that Josh gave us to answer, if evolution happened, what does that mean with regard to your view on life and how we think about the world? I would just say I have adopted it as my core religious narrative. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you so much for those presentations. think they were both just really interesting. I had a lot of depth to them. I mean, these are clearly things you guys have thought about for a long time, and really come to. I think what's more about this, it's more than just an intellectual thought. There's some personal experience in there too. And I guess maybe we're all religious naturalists. You can be a Christian if you want to, but we'll see. Anyways, I just want to take this a little further into discussion, and either one of you can answer this, or both of you. To just kind of get to kind of some of the core of why these topics can be challenging for some people and what some of the stereotypes are. Now, many people see science as the only source of objective truth. Would you agree with that, or would you see it differently?
Well, since I seem to be the vocabulary person here, we first have to figure out what we mean by objective. I would say to that question that I regard something as being evaluated objectively if it's something that a number of people in a group can all look at the evidence, all have access to what is being talked about, all can have an opinion, there's nothing hidden, and you then look at it and come to a decision as to whether it's true or false using scientific method or whatever language you want to figure out that. I think that that's how most of our understandings of science have developed. I also, though, am fully believe in, if I use that word, subjective truth, which is the truth that we feel within our own beings and hearts and souls. That is very difficult to share. You have no idea whether I'm thinking of an Elvis Presley tune in my head or not. And no one could figure that out. And even if I told you that I was, I might be lying. But I don't think that there's anything less truthful about my subjective experience than there is about objective truth. So I think that there are two kinds of truths, and we don't have to get all wedged about that at all.
Well, I'm tempted to start off with a Pontius Pilate question, which is, what is truth? You can find that in the appropriate gospel. You can look it up. Science is not so much a source of truth as it is a method. And when we teach science, all too frequently we teach science as though it were a body of knowledge, a bunch of facts to be committed to memory and memorized. And in fact, science is a process. And no one is more skeptical of a scientific finding than another scientist, because we realize that science is always necessarily incomplete, and science is always necessarily tentative. I'm frequently, in my advocacy for evolution, I'm frequently challenged by people who say, well, evolution isn't proven. Right. That's because we don't prove things in science. What we do is we try to put propositions out there which are testable and therefore are disprovable. And what science is an extraordinarily powerful method for finding out what works and what doesn't work in terms of explanations about the natural world. But it's not the only source of truth. I might think it's true that Mozart was a greater composer than someone else, but science doesn't help me find that out. I might think that it is true that there's a certain standard of justice and human rights to which all individuals are entitled, but science doesn't help me find that out either. And the very concept of truth itself is a philosophical concept that we can't always express empirically. I think there are many ways to find truth outside of science. All of the humanities are engaged in one sense or another in a search for that truth. When I read, for example, a poem by Robert Frost, or when I read a story by William Faulkner, if it's a great poem or a great story, I get the sense within me that it's true. And I'm a particular fan of Faulkner's writings, which I think are true on a very deep level, even though they're all fiction, because there is a way to connect that comes out of the arts and even the social sciences, which is not empirical and not scientific. So is science the only way to find objective truth? Depends on what you mean by objective truth. Science is the means to find out how the natural world works. And we have all sorts of questions we want answered about the natural world, and we have answered many of them scientifically. But do you know what? There are an awful lot of other questions that matter to each of us, to every person in this room, that are really not amenable to being studied by science. And for these, we have philosophy, we have theology, we have the arts, and we have other means to address truth. So science has no monopoly on this, and there are certain areas that really matter to us that science really can't address.
Yeah, thanks for those thoughts. So you kind of mentioned like personal experiences or subjective truth in that regard, and you talk about like metaphysical truths about like art or morality. I guess I would also throw in there like historical truth is something that isn't always testable, but it is a truth that you can access as well.
Example, what was the Civil War about? You can go to certain states in the United States and get slightly different answers to that question. I once was giving a seminar at a great university in the southern part of our country, which I will not name. And in a nice cocktail party afterwards, I was chatting with someone about the Civil War, and I was tapped on the shoulder, and a person greeted me with a big smile and said, "You mean the War of Northern Aggression?" And that's the sort of thing. And I'm the father of a history teacher. One of my daughters is the one who has suffered using my biology book. Naturally, she became a historian. And one of the things that she's emphasized is that history, in a sense, is always a search for truth. And you can use scientific techniques to answer certain questions in history. But when you ultimately make a judgment about an event that involved millions of people and was enormously complicated as to what was the cause of this conflict, science helps you, but it doesn't give you final answers.
Yeah, I would agree with both of you. I basically think, and I'm sure there are people in the audience that disagree, so please put in questions and we'll address it more deeply. But I guess this gets to the whole point too, that this isn't really a debate, it's kind of more of a conversation between friends, so just about these topics. So here's the next question that I wanted to kind of ask. Like, let's just take for a moment and assume that human beings evolve through natural processes. And we can find satisfactory scientific explanations for how the universe itself came to being. Do you think that means that there's no ultimate cause or purpose to the universe?
Okay. Richard Dawkins, who I regard as a friend and a colleague, once wrote, and I'm not going to get this quite right, but I'm going to get it pretty close, that the universe we know about through science has neither good nor evil, nor meaning nor purpose. There is in the universe nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And I've always been struck by that quotation in part because I've always wondered, how does Richard manage to get up in the morning if that's what he thinks the universe is like? And at a conference where he and I shared the platform at NYU a few years back, I actually asked him that. And he said, and you have to think of the really good Oxford accent in somebody saying this. And he goes, well, the universe may not have a purpose, but I do. And nonetheless, here's what struck me about that. In that quotation, he's effectively using the authority of science to say that life is without purpose, that the universe is without purpose or meaning. Let's suppose that I was to go to the meetings this fall of the American Society for Cell Biology, which Ursula and I both go to on a regular basis. And I was to get one of those little 12-minute talks, and I get up on the platform, to an audience just like this, and I started to say in my first sentence, through some experiments I've done in the past year, I have discovered the meaning and purpose of life. What do you think the audience reaction would be? They'd be out there in the corridor saying, come here, you gotta hear this, Miller's losing it. They would immediately recognize that science is not a method by which you discover meaning and purpose. And I agree with that. But curiously, Dawkins would argue, from science you can discover that there is no purpose. And I would argue that science is inadequate to discover that as well. So the notion of what is the purpose of existence? Does the universe itself have a meaning? Does our existence have a meaning? I think science can enrich the material from which we draw conclusions about meaning, value, and purpose, but it can't tell us what those conclusions are.
Well, once again, I'm into definitions. So I would say that it has to, first of all, I think Richard's comment was ridiculous because he doesn't know. But I would say also that it really depends on, for example, whether we're talking about meaning and purpose with a capital M and a capital B, a P, as, you know, this huge thing, or whether we're talking about meaning and purpose with lowercase m and lowercase p. And if we do the latter, then meaning and purpose have everything to do with what life is. The whole deal about being an organism is to figure out the meaning of one's environment and one's food and what one should do next. And purpose really showed up, at least lowercase p purpose, showed up, I would argue, on this planet with life forms. They definitely have a purpose to fit in and reproduce and be alive. So meaning and purpose, at least proximately with lower p and lower m letters, is rife in everything around us. And since I've already explained that I'm not worried about the ultimate, whether there's capital P meaning and purpose, I'm very satisfied with what the meaning and purpose that I encounter every moment of my life.
So what exactly is the capital P purpose and the capital I mean? I don't know if I understand exactly what you mean by that.
What I mean is, well, I remember one of the first times I went out to a college somewhere and started talking about this religious naturalism stuff, and it was a Christian college, and there was a young woman who was getting very upset, and she said that for her, if there wasn't any God, which I wasn't even arguing, but that was what she was hearing, she said my life would have no meaning. And at the time I felt just really awful that was the way it was. And so that's what I'm assuming you mean and meant by your question, of that if there is no creator, if there's no one watching, if there's in that kind of God language, that means that anything else is useless. Or at least that was what I got from her response.
So, kind of taking this a little bit farther, yeah. Well, I mean, it's a nice question, but it kind of goes on this idea of purpose. And, you know, as we kind of start to construct ideas of like purpose in like metaphysics or who God is, you know, given like certain views about how things came to being, like given the constraints of like accepted science that there are right now, what sort of God or purposes do you think it's reasonable to believe in? And or conversely, why do you think it's not reasonable to believe in God? I don't think that's actually where any of us are here, which is okay, but like what do you think the constraints are and what's reasonable to believe about what that God is or what those purposes are that we can hold?
So I'm a non-theist. Go.
Okay. First of all, this is not a forum where we're debating theism versus atheism or non-theism. So, and I know Ursula and I could have a fine time doing that. But in terms of what sort of God is it reasonable to believe in, I'm a Christian in the Roman Catholic tradition. The reason I am is because I find that my faith gives me a sense of meaning and purpose that helps me to make sense of my life. And also because I find the stories of Jesus in Scripture to be persuasive. And what I mean by persuasive is they provide me with an outlook towards life, which I feel that I know I will always fall short of, but to which I aspire in a way that I think makes me a better person and gives me a sense of fulfillment in my ordinary life and also in my scientific work as well. One of the things as a person of faith that I'm often asked by many of my skeptical friends, especially in the scientific community, is to say, well, you know, there's only one science, but there are many religions, so they can't all be true. I mean, the Muslims can't have it right, and the Buddhists can't have it right, and the Protestants can't have it right, and the Mormons can't all have it right at the same time. So doesn't that mean this is so highly subjective you can't make any sense out of it? And my answer to that is I think all of these religious traditions are an effort to grapple with something in the human spirit that senses that there is something that's beyond nature, that requires an explanation. And as I say, my own religious tradition is the one I find persuasive, but I don't find it persuasive to the point where I would devalue or would exclude other religious traditions. There's one other thing that I feel fortunate about having been brought up in that tradition, and that is the sense that faith and reason are both gifts from God. And this very much goes back to the Augustinian tradition, and it's explicit in the writings of Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. And that is that faith and reason should complement each other in terms of their explorations of nature. So what kind of God is it reasonable to believe in? The answer is a God who fashioned a universe that works according to principles that we can actually understand and evaluate through our rational faculties. So that's the way I would answer.
Can you just take a moment and explain what's persuasive about the story of Jesus exactly?
I mean, Jesus was amazing. I was brought up on the gospel stories. I still am, slack-jawed when I read some of the things that he said. I hold him in the highest possible view. I also hold the Buddha in the highest possible view. I also hold many other remarkable persons throughout history in remarkable view. So the trick, of course, I mean, you guys who are Christians have heard this all the time. Oh yeah, I think Jesus must have been a great God. And as opposed to having other beliefs about who he was. So again, there is the wonderful things about Jesus that I aspire to try to emulate.
Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll add just one thing, and that is modesty. What you find in the personality that comes through from the Gospels is not someone who sought temporal power, not someone who sought to condemn, not someone who sought to force everyone to bend to his will, but someone who taught to persuade. And in a context, in a society that was very obsessed with the law, broadly construed, when he was questioned about the law, the response was there were just two commandments, and that is you shall love the Lord thy God with thy whole heart, thy whole mind, and thy whole soul, and thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And the very simplicity and the modesty of that command is the thing that I've always found appealing. And I think many non-Christians find that appealing too, when they regard Jesus as a non-divine but historical figure.
Yeah, so, and for the prior question, if you want to add more to that, you can too. But I did actually want to ask you, and then, well, so we've been talking about how evolution might inform our views on faith, and you also just mentioned a little bit earlier just how your faith has really deepened your scientific work. And I'm sure you would say some of your religious experience of evolution has deepened your scientific work. So how would you explain to us how that's the case?
I don't know. I think you were looking over her shoulder, but just before we started, Ursula opened her laptop, and she showed me a freeze-fracture electron micrograph of a Chlamydomonas reinhardti cell And I oohed and ahed and groaned at how exquisitely beautiful it was. I hope there's some biologists in the room. She had in these images 2 cross fractures of the most beautiful Golgi apparatus that I'd seen in a long time. You can see the cristae in the mitochondria, the chloroplast envelope membranes, the endoplasmic reticulum in this beautiful 3-dimensional bas relief that you get in freeze fracture. It was just dazzling. And I don't think I've ever stopped being a little kid when it came to looking at the inner workings of life. And the sort of deep reverence for nature that I think Ursula expressed really well in her talk is something that anyone with a passion for science shares. Now, I'm not going to pretend that I look at an electron micrograph and I see St. Paul or something along those lines. But what I see is a world, and this is what evolution tells us, in which you and I are bound together in the fabric of life with every other living thing on this planet. And I find that to be not a dehumanizing position. I find that to be an ennobling conception, to realize that the same molecules, the same chemical pathways, the same cellular structures that we find in each of us, we find, for example, in this tiny little green algae, whose electron micrograph Ursula showed me before this. And if that doesn't make your heart beat quick, you're not alive.
I'll let you respond. And by the way, what he's telling is totally true. I was like, whoa, these guys are really into freeze fracture. It's not my field, so I have to. Anyways. All right. I'm excited. We're going to have like a little geek session in the corner. You're welcome to join us afterwards. I'll also point out this. I'm a practicing scientist as well, and it is a little bit intimidating me up here with 2 very renowned scientists. Both of them have written very famous textbooks, and I'm just little me. I've only been a professor for the 3rd or 4th or 10th time, but eventually I'm going to come to understand some of the people behind it.
Let me add something to that, and Ursula may have something to add too. Paul Davies is a cosmologist, Australian cosmologist, so I think now he's at the University of Arizona.
Oh, actually, one more thing I gotta say. I missed this. This is actually important. So, I'm sorry. We're gonna continue the conversation, but in the meantime, if you want to pass your questions forward, we're gonna get to them in a moment. And if I forget to tell them that, then we have a big pause.
It's cool. It's all right. So I was mentioning this guy named Paul Davies, and a few years ago, Davies wrote an op-ed column in the New York Times, and one of the things, and this relates to what you just said, Josh, about faith in science, and in that op-ed column, he pointed out that in his training as a physics PhD, he would every now and then ask one of his professors, where do the laws of physics come from? And the usual response of both physics professors was, go away, kid, you bother me. A few of them said, look, it's not our job as physicists to ask where the laws come from. It's our job to find out what they are and then help people to apply them. But ultimately, he said the laws of physics have to come from somewhere. There has to be some sort of a source. Now, he's not exactly making an argument for theism, because Paul Davies is not really a theist. But he pointed out in this piece something that I've always been impressed by, and that is he said, all scientists share an element of faith. There is a faith in science. And that faith is, there are 2 elements of that. The first one is that there is an objective reality out there that we can investigate and understand. Now, if that seems obvious, you haven't talked to a philosopher lately. Because the notion that there is an objective reality that is rationally interrogatable is actually not an obvious proposition to a lot of philosophers. But he says, all scientists share that faith. And then the second article of faith that all scientists share is very simple, and that is that knowledge is better than ignorance. So in other words, not only is there something out there we can figure out, but it's worth figuring out. And I think to a person of faith, this fits right in with the belief in God. Lots of people I know who are not theists still share those 2 elements of faith that I just mentioned. There's an intelligible universe, and it's worth knowing. And that's something that's common in science.
So what does the God part add?
Now we get to the good stuff. Okay. To me, what the God part does is it completes my understanding of nature intellectually. And here's what I mean by this. If one argues, to be an atheist, or even to be an agnostic, I think one has to argue that nature is self-explanatory. And that is that there is no explanation necessary for why nature is here, or in Paul Davies' terms, for where the laws of physics come from. I think that's a profoundly radical philosophical proposition. In a piece, in an article that I wrote a couple of years ago, I put a sentence in after making a statement like that, where I said, the curiosity of the theist is greater than that of the non-theist. A lot of people take offense to that. Because I said, the theist ultimately is asking the question of why the universe should be susceptible to rational interrogation. And the non-theist is simply saying, I don't need an explanation for nature. And to me, what God does for that, to me, is close the circle to give an explanation for this sort of thing. And in line with your young friend, who said that her life would be without meaning, what the hypothesis of God gives me, among other things, is a sense that the morality, the sense of right and wrong, that we all share, whether we're believers or not. I've never met an atheist who didn't have a strongly ingrained sense of right and wrong. But what this tells me, what the hypothesis of God tells me, is that that sense of right and wrong has a deep spiritual validity. The questions about what is the good life are worth interrogating, if only because ultimately they have an answer, even if we struggle to find out what it is.
Okay, well, I think, speaking for myself, but I don't think I'm the only one, speaking for the non-theistic, there is another way of approaching these unanswerable questions, like, why is there anything at all rather than nothing? That's, for me, the juicy one. Now, if there's anything at all, then it's lawful and it has physics and all that stuff. But, why is there anything at all? And for what it's worth, what I've come to and what I put in my book and so on is that another option is simply to be comfortable with accepting whatever with mystery. And I will go ahead and put a capital M on that, because I did in my book, and say that I have a covenant with mystery, that I'm comfortable with the idea that there are things that I don't understand, and I don't, therefore isn't right, but in my search, in my science, in my life, in my loves, the God part not being there doesn't mean that I figure that those aren't questions to be asked, nor that, but I don't have any way of answering them, so I'm cool with mystery.
I'm not sure I ultimately have a way of answering. You want to be conversations. That's what we got. I'm not sure I have any way of answering it either based on that. But I'll tell you something, and that is, I put an Einstein quote on one of my slides. My favorite Einstein quote, and I always mention this to my students at the end of the semester in my general biology course, is this one. And that is, from Einstein, the most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source of all true art and science. And as you know, I'm married to an artist. And therefore, the sense of mystery that an artist does something, and when they do a work, they don't own it anymore, even if they've created it. It has a meaning that develops in the person who sees it. And that's the most mysterious part of art, especially of great art. And I think ultimately I'm comfortable with mystery too, not in the sense that I don't want the answers to everything I can get my grubby little hands on, but in the sense that ultimately one has to be reconciled, as I mentioned earlier, that science is always going to be incomplete, and that's part of the exhilaration of science. And for those of you who are not scientists, you might think the most frustrating thing to a scientist would be mystery, Actually, that's not true. Mystery is exhilarating. The most frustrating thing to a scientist is to look in the mirror or to have somebody else tell you, you know what? The fundamental questions in your field of inquiry have all been answered. That's a real bummer. Nothing is worse than that.
So as you can see, we could have this conversation for a lot longer, and it'd be interesting to follow. So thank you guys so much for just kind of getting us into this.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.